Welcome, everyone. Looks like folks are filing in. We're going to give it about another 30 seconds for a few more people to join us, and then we will kick things right off. Welcome, folks. I think we'll get started. For those of you not familiar with South Pole, we're a sustainability consultancy company and a climate project developer. We've been around since 2006, founded and headquartered in Zurich. Since then, we have grown to be a truly global operation in dozens of countries on all continents. We work with hundreds of companies, organizations, and the public sector on reducing their carbon footprints and many other sustainability issues. My name is Nick Astor, and I'm in charge of marketing for the US and Canada. South Pole is well known for hosting exciting conversations on climate change, its relationship to global well-being, and the action that companies can take to address it. With the advent on the COVID-19 crisis, we've had to move our events online, and that's why we're here today. Most of you have been pretty familiar with GoToWebinars, Zooms, and various other online events since all of this got rolling. So I think you know the drill, but do excuse bad lighting, occasional audio glitches, and unexpected visits by children. Just to go through a little bit of housekeeping, we will be doing a nice Q&A for about 15 to 20 minutes at the end of this conversation. To ask a question, all you have to do is type it into the comment box on the GoToWebinar control panel, which you should be seeing on the right side of your screen. You can also raise your hand by clicking the hand icon, and we will call on you directly, unmute your microphone, and you can speak directly to us that way. So the purpose of today's conversation, and we do very much intend this to be a conversation with plenty of time for interaction at the end, is to introduce a new framework called the Climate Journey. The aim of the journey concept is to make it easier for companies to achieve a leading position in taking action on climate change. And it works by introducing some structure to help companies determine where they stand on climate, what priorities make sense, which actions they should take, and how they can communicate their success. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Charles Henderson, South Pole's head of corporate climate strategies, as well as Muireann Gibbons-Neff. She is our regional lead for North America. And we'll turn on our videos and properly say hello. Hi, Muireann. There's Charlie. Great. Let's start with the basics, Charlie. We're calling this a journey. Why a journey? Why use that metaphor when talking about corporate climate action?
Yeah, good question. I think for me, there's three main reasons why we found this concept of a journey useful, and our clients have. First thing is that, to many of us, sustainability and climate change are incredibly complicated concepts. They change very, very quickly, and the agenda moves on. And therefore, the first obstacle is understanding the agenda. And the idea of a journey is help businesses and us internally, let's be frank, to make sense of them around a structure. And it's something that we've related to since we were all children, and that is a storyline. Second thing is that South Pole is an action-orientated provider of climate solutions and sustainability solutions. And our mission is to develop long-term relationships with clients, help them understand the A to Z of this agenda, and to deliver meaningful change to be resilient and thrive in the low-carbon economy. And the journey gives a sense of direction and progress and purpose. And the third thing is that the steps and building blocks of the journey can be broken down in a very logical way and assessed against the needs of stakeholders, and also allow them to benchmark themselves against each other, competitors, on an ongoing basis. And the journey helps understand where to go next. But having said all that, a journey isn't prescriptive. It's really just a loose conceptual framework, and everyone's journey is going to be different depending on their sector and their business. And it will, of course, change over time, and it will evolve, and we'll come to that in a minute. So as we go through, we'd love in the Q&A to hear about your experiences of your journey. So please share those with us.
And I'm going to turn it over to
Just
Mo. Can you walk us through the journey itself, and as it is diagrammed, we have our sort of introductory slide in front of us here. Maybe walk us through what these different components actually mean.
Certainly, very, very briefly. So it's a 5-step journey. First one is measuring. It's kind of a benchmarking and sort of baselining step. Understand the carbon footprint, know what risks are currently and projected into the future. Armed with that information, really those are the kind of key cornerstones of building blocks. Businesses can start to set roadmaps, create a vision and set targets, be they science-based or not. Then we go through into the implementation stage, which is reduction, step 3, through energy efficiency, renewable energy, decarbonisation, financing climate action, particularly with net zero as a growing agenda. And also this speaks to the heritage of South Pole as a project developer, is equally important. That is about mitigating and offsetting irreducible emissions. And then finally, step 5 is the communications and lead. That is to effectively to accelerate action amongst the sector peers, and also through consumers, clients, and employees too.
Perfect. I want to turn it over to Muireann really quick, and I'm curious, when you're meeting with a company, perhaps for the first time, where does this conversation begin? Not everybody's at the same place in this journey. How do you determine where a company stands, and how do you start this conversation about this journey?
Yeah, thank you, Nick and Charlie. So, as Charlie started to mention, a big part of why this journey concept was born was that we had a lot of companies coming to us, and saying, well, we want to achieve XYZ sustainability goal, we want to just be sustainable, we want to be green, but not really having a concept of how to go about that or what that even really means. And very often seeing sustainability as just a set defined goal and not really as a journey, right? A fluid sort of journey that they can continue onwards. So most of the time, the conversation really just starts with introducing this concept and using it as a way to sort of imagine the art of the possible within the context of a certain company. So what are their goals? Why? Who's it being driven by? Where's the impetus coming from? You really need to understand what's going on within a company and amongst its external stakeholders or any of the other pressure levers that might be at play. So, this enables us to kind of introduce this framework and set the goalposts in that very first conversation, and really then work with the company to understand, okay, this is a journey and here's what it might look like. Here's where you might fall within it. So it really helps us target the questions we ask from the get-go. And, we always say that a lot of sustainability efforts will fail if they're not entrenched in the overarching corporate strategy, right? And people talk a lot about values and mission when it comes to sustainability and corporate responsibility at large, but really you need to integrate it everywhere within your strategy and your operations. So a lot of those first conversations are about getting to know a company, getting them socialized with this concept of the journey, and then helping them figure out what it will actually look like for them so that it can actually be a meaningful part of the business, and part of their core culture as well as business operations.
And Charlie, even though we're talking about this as a journey, we're not suggesting that there's a start and a finish to this journey, are we? We're not implying that there's a hierarchy of action here. How do you address that if people think that's what we're talking about?
Yeah, I think that's a key point, Nick. This isn't prescriptive. It's a framework. It's kind of an architecture, if you like. And it's a sort of helpful checklist of best practice to ensure a business can thrive into the future. But it's also flexible. So, the sustainability agenda is very fast moving. So it's flexible enough to accommodate that. Having said that, currently, as we see it within South Pole, the most popular kind of climate goal, or the most topical one, is net zero. We've seen some of the oil majors and also, continents such as the EU making a pledge towards net zero. And this is driven by a scientific imperative. And it's also what underpins, the elements of the Paris Agreement. So, that aligns with 1.5 trajectory as a maximum warning ceiling. And it includes removals and avoidance of other emissions. So that's, if you like, current goal. But having said that, things change, and who knows where we're going to be in a few years. We might all be heading towards net positive goals. So we wouldn't want people to feel that this is a limiting factor. And also, every business, every sector is different. 1.5 trajectory might not be technologically achievable or financially viable for many sectors right now. So every business has its own journey. And we when we work with clients, we recognize that, and we set those targets and then vision, if you like, accordingly. Also, one last point is this framework can be used not just for climate change. It's also usable for water, for plastics, for waste. So it's kind of multidisciplinary, if you like, and we're applying it in many different instances across different themes.
So just sorry, I guess to re-emphasize the question, I'm curious to hear from each of you how you have seen evidence that this framework works, that this is in fact the right path to guide companies along this so-called journey.
I mean, the cheeky answer, right, is like it isn't. And as Charlie emphasized, it's not a linear, clear-cut thing. It's a framework, right? But we are very confident that it is the right framework and tool to put that structure needed on corporate sustainability, which is this kind of topic and nebulous concept that can be really unruly and overwhelming and is also incredibly dynamic. So what we feel we've really struck the balance with here is this framework that has just the right amount of guidance and flexibility, but it's also malleable enough to make it right for everyone. And as Charlie just said, it can apply to just looking at climate change from a carbon perspective. It can apply water, plastics, by starting off with measuring your footprint and doing a holistic risk assessment, you're able to zero in at the start on what you actually should be focusing on. So you're not making crazy investments or wasting resources going down certain roads that don't make sense. So, as consultants, as a management consultant by training is my background, we're trained to apply structure to challenges. That's what we do, right? So we break them down into tangible pieces that we can then actually tackle with clients and companies. So that's what we did with the climate leadership journey. So, I always joke, I think about integrating it into your business toolkit the same way you would like a SWOT analysis, right? It's just another framework that should guide the way you approach your business. But, we're confident it's the right one, not only because it is flexible and it's a powerful framework, but after years of experience and working with many different companies across many different sectors, all shapes, sizes, forms, public, private, we saw these common trends emerge, right? And looking at the companies who really did well and were successful in their sustainability strategies, you start to see these patterns of they really understand where they're starting from, right? They do the right sort of risk and baselining, then they take really specific actions in these major categories. And then this key concept at the end of being able to really effectively communicate and advocate very often sets them apart as well. So that was kind of the genesis of why we developed this and have confidence that it works.
Yeah, thanks, Muireann. I'll just sort of re-emphasize a point, which I think is a key point here. Through experience, we've kind of tracked that most of the clients we work with have in some way engaged in this journey, whether or not they even know it. Many businesses will feel that they are kind of rookies to this agenda and they haven't even started on their sustainability journey. But actually, when you start sort of picking the stones up and scratching beneath the surface, you'll find that there's quite often elements of this already going on, whether they know it or not, or whether they brand it or recognize it as sustainability. So, for example, regulatory compliance, often moves the environmental agenda and sustainability agenda on and within a business. Energy saving for cost saving, waste reduction, or even sort of rationalizing inventories for space, or minimizing waste for the same reason. And we've all experienced really fired up employees who have kind of the green champions, if you like, who have taken the initiative and they've made things happen. They've raised the flag and made everyone else aware of sustainability as an important agenda. And so quite often, this kind of conceptual framework helps businesses to, see where the gaps are, and if you like, to backfill against those, to put the building blocks in place so they're complete. So then a bigger picture vision and strategy, and then hence targets and reduction program can come off the back of that. So it's not a one size fits all, but as in our experience, it pretty much covers all the bases.
Terrific. I'd love to get down to the hard evidence here. Can you walk us through a couple of client stories, perhaps, where you've seen this framework yield some tangible results, some focus, some real ROI?
Yeah, absolutely. I can share a couple examples, and I know Charlie has many as well. And there's so many different ways to answer this, because the benefits of applying this framework have materialized in lots of different ways. But for one example, a large company in the industrial sector came to us a couple years ago saying, we've never really done anything on sustainability. We don't have a function, we don't have a sustainability report, but it's now a priority for our leadership, and we recognize it's important. And we actually have set the goal of becoming a sustainability leader in our market within 3 to 5 years. How do we do that? And that was the mandate, right? And so we used this framework to basically structure that engagement and take them through the journey of, okay, you're starting at the very, very beginning, and then this is what it might look like, and here's how you're going to get to a point of leadership by following these steps. And so the actual scope of work of that engagement was crafted basically on this framework and on this journey. And it was one of the first companies that South Pole used the whole framework on, and has been a really pivotal case study for us, ever since. Other clients have come to us, midway through the journey and say they want to improve this one specific thing or take their standing to the next level. And again, being able to really quickly diagnose, okay, you know your risks, you've done a roadmap and targets, but you're not really reducing your footprint maybe in everywhere that you can, or communicating it effectively. It's helped improve our relationships as well with companies, and companies' relationships with their own stakeholders, because they have this clarity, and so they're able to improve the way they communicate. Sustainability managers have been able to take things to their board or their executives with a much clearer vision in mind. We do workshops where we kind of have walked companies through this, and that's how you're able to get all of your stakeholders on board. So that's been really powerful too. And basically being able to have a roadmap from day one instead of taking weeks or months to develop one, which is often the case in advisory work, makes things a lot more efficient and powerful for our companies and our clients, and for us as advisors. From a communications perspective, another consumer goods company we worked with, they're actually using the rough structure of this framework to improve their communications. So, they've started by tackling their footprinting a little better, getting more holistic on understanding their risks, and then they're integrating those findings into their annual sustainability report, and then talking about how they're going to tackle those environmental footprints and develop a 5 to 10 year climate change strategy using the framework as guidance. And that's actually, going into external communications, and it's resonating with their stakeholders in a way that they weren't quite able to achieve before in their sustainability reporting. And then I'd say one final example from my side, a chemicals company, once they basically used the journey to target their market analysis and R&D efforts on what's happening in the sustainability world. So sort of a version of step one, they sort of did a market analysis, looked at their own footprint, looked at their risks, and then focused basically their product development, their new sort of chemicals and polymers, by tracking it against sustainability trends and risks. And this actually, impacted their whole R&D and product development strategy, and they saw much better results for the next 2 years as a result, because they had sort of tracked against what was coming down the market. So just a couple of examples of how we've brought this to life, and I'll pass it over to Charlie to share a couple more.
Great, thanks, Muireann. So one really good example comes to mind, and this one was driven specifically by a financial ROI, and the CFO, as many of you all will attest, wanted a very swift financial return on investment. So, perhaps there was a little bit of skepticism about the sustainability agenda. So, and we needed to prove quick wins. So we focused very, very heavily on those quick wins, and in their case, that meant energy efficiency. So a lot of the journey, if you like, was towards being a more energy efficient business to start with. And therefore, that's where our work streams focused. And in the first year, we identified savings of over 3 million US from energy savings. And also, we helped them better integrate energy into their decision-making process, whereas it had been a very disparate kind of agenda. With facilities managers making almost autonomous decisions, we helped introduce a structure so that energy was managed in a more centralized way. There were building management systems introduced. There was better tracking and monitoring, more energy, like meters were put in. And anyway, as a result of all this, these very, very quick wins, this very, very quick energy saving was realized. And that allowed the business to effectively to prove the ROI, to tick the boxes in terms of their return on investment horizons, but then also to invest that money into other sustainability initiatives. And in their case, because they wanted to be a carbon neutral business, they used that money for certificates, renewable energy certificates, further energy efficiency action, and carbon offsets. So they actually became a carbon neutral business in a cost neutral way within the space of a year or so, which is an astonishing result. And that, of course, proved the business case. It got people on board. It was a great story to tell, and it sort of pump primed the subsequent phases of the initiative. So that's the very financial driven ROI, but I think it's important to mention that ROI doesn't just look financial these days, particularly on the sustainability agenda. First thing is around shareholder value. So much of the value of shares these days is intangible. According to one initiative, the Embankment Project, over 50% of share value now is intangible. And that boils down to governance, reputation, and also the talent within a business. And those are the main underpinning elements of this intangible value. And sustainable thinking is at the core of this. And increasingly, investors are scrutinizing, through the SASB, TCFD frameworks, etc., what these intangible elements look like, and making sure that businesses are future-proof and resilient. So the ROI isn't necessarily immediate, but particularly the price of borrowing money is cheaper with good ESG ratings, and that, of course, is facilitated by looking at the sustainability agenda, being able to prove the case and disclose against it. Secondly, the license to operate. Customers and communities and employees, NGOs, they're increasingly recognizing sustainability as a core component of brand value. And in this social media age, where fortunes can be lost on the basis of one tweet, this is more and more binary. You have the saints and sinners of the sustainability agenda. Also, many people see it. So it's increasingly important to recognize that and to bake in a sustainability focus in terms of long-term strategy. And finally, if there's one thing that COVID-19 and the crisis we're facing is going to prove to us, it's that no business is immune to unexpected natural events, and that's increasingly being recognised by governments. One example there is the Canadian government is actually making a TCFD and a net zero thinking or ambition part of a condition of bailout for the oil and gas sector in Canada. So as a result of all of this, we're finding demand for, particularly looking at sustainability through a risks and opportunities lens and running scenarios against that. Is becoming, we're getting increasing demand for that service in particular. as the longer term perspective on return on investment is considered.
Excellent. I'm really excited. I've got about one more question for you guys, but I'm really excited. I've been sort of going through the attendee list. We've got dozens and dozens of really interesting companies and folks from organizations attending this webinar. So I want to remind you guys to get your questions ready. Now's the time to type those questions into the question box and/or raise your hand. And if anybody has stories that they want to tell us about what they're doing at their companies, we'd certainly love to hear those stories as well. Are you using a framework? Do you like this framework? Do you perhaps have a different way of thinking about this? I'd be delighted to hear from as many people as possible in the time that we have left. So my last question to you guys is really, where is this all going? It sounds like you've already learned quite a bit about how effective this framework can be. How do you see it evolving? You mentioned that it might be able to be ultimately used for things besides just climate. I'm curious about that. And in a nutshell, where is South Pole planning to take this?
Sure, happy to take that one first. So we very much see this as a starting point. It's a new framework for us. And we would love to do more research and better understand how it applies to different sectors, to different businesses at different stages of the journey, if you like, different parts of the evolution of the sustainability agenda. So I think that's where we want to take it first, is to do some analysis, to do some research, and then to use that to apply that in different instances, so we can refine it and make it perhaps a bit more prescriptive to different sectors and different types of business. As a company at South Pole, I've already mentioned net zero as one of our kind of guiding ambitions, or sort of certainly areas where we're focusing our attention and thought leadership and so on. Another one is sustainable finance. Increasingly we're having our clients say we want to go beyond and look at the step 5 where we're advocating. We want to be making sure that our investments are future-proofed against this agenda, and actually we want to do good with our money. So increasingly we have a community of practice around that. Nature-based solutions is always been part of what we do as a project developer, but increasingly we are having having requests from our clients that their offsets and their climate neutral net zero positions are based around removals through the best practice biodiversity offsets. Number 4 is renewable energy. Increasingly we're looking at this journey in relation to on-site certificate driven an increased proportion of net zero, and many of our clients of course have an RE 100 commitment. And the 5th element is one more, which is plastics. We've had a huge amount of interest recently in the plastics agenda, as you would expect. So increasingly we're developing systems to footprints, and then also we're developing plastic offset projects too. So I'd say developing journeys specific to those themes, but then also at a sectoral level is really the next stage for us.
Yeah, and I mean, to echo what Charlie said, the journey continues, right, for us and for our clients. So, continuing to refine, to gain data points and points of view on all of these, especially in the focus areas that you just mentioned, Charlie. It's our job as consultants and advisors to also keep iterating on this framework. And, the ways that we measure and think about risk are undoubtedly going to continue to evolve. If this year has shown us anything, it's that risk and resiliency is really important, and the things that we have to consider under that umbrella of risk, there's things we look at now, particularly in the social arena, that maybe weren't on the agenda 3 months ago. And similarly in finance and climate action, the options there and sort of the world of what that looks like is going to evolve, because this is a dynamic field. And so, the beauty of this journey is it will evolve along with it, and still provide those goalposts, for companies to continue the really important work moving forward.
Terrific. Question time. We have a few questions rolling in. We'll start with a question from Vanessa. She wants to know how successful can a sustainability strategy be if it's implemented as a result of external pressure? If we need clarity on that, we can perhaps get some, but your response.
So it's a very interesting question, actually. The first step of the journey is this measure of footprint and risks, and that also includes a materiality assessment. So, there's two axes to that. One is what external, stakeholders are asking of the business, and that's everything through from investors to customers, clients, to NGOs and and regulators. Then there's the internal drivers, and those two, or generally meet in the middle. They cannot be taken in isolation. So we shouldn't be afraid of listening to our audiences. I mean, ultimately, that's what we're all there to do as businesses, is to serve the needs of our clients and customers. And we need to be cognizant of those and not feel that we need to be making all the driving sort of noises and the push. There's always a pull at the other side. So I'd say it's somewhere in the middle, actually. Both of those stakeholder groups need to be recognized.
And I'd also back that up by saying, if you distill down any business strategy, right, whether it's, about the products you're offering or anything, it's usually driven at some level by external pressures, right? A change in the market, a change in your customer base, a change in your supply chain, your pricing. So don't think of sustainability as being any different, right? We're responding to the external context. And so that can be just as successful as when it is, more internally driven. And to Charlie's point, I think it needs to be that balance of both. But really, at the end of the day, businesses exist to serve their customers, right? So you can be entirely successful by being responsive to an external pressure, as long as the way that you respond works for your business, works and aligns with your values and your leadership, and all of those important success factors.
I'm going to give folks a couple more minutes to craft their question. I'll throw one out while we're waiting. One of the last things you mentioned, Charlie, was how climate action is ultimately about building resilience for the future, resilience for your company itself, but probably resilience in a more broad sense in terms of climate resilience and economic resilience and so on. Could either of you tell us a little bit more about that? To me, that's one of the most, given the times we're living in right now, that seems like one of the biggest benefits to all of this. Just curious your response.
Sure. No, it's of course ever more topical as an agenda item. But even before this crisis, the frameworks such as TCFD have really brought the idea of climate resilience up the agenda very fast. And that was really, this is a framework, for those of you who don't know, a framework driven by the investor community, where they've broken down climate resilience into two different pillars, if you like. One of those is the physical risks of climate change, heavy precipitation, heat waves, sea level rise, cyclones. And the other is the transition risks of climate change. So that's carbon pricing, legislation, reputational damage, and technological shifts and market changes. So any business should be considering those factors when it plays forward and it looks at what the future might hold. So increasingly, we are running those assessments for our clients, and that enables them to effectively stress test their business models in a 1.5 degree warm world, where we have, for example, very, very highly regulated markets and a high carbon price, against a world where we allow climate change to continue unabated, where we might be in a 3 or 4 degree scenario. And then what are the physical risks that come of that? So, resilience can mean lots of different things. There's lots of possible futures out there, but more and more businesses are looking at what those potential futures are and look at how their business model stacks up against all of them.
was mute, sorry. Got another question coming in here. Thinking back to the journey itself, the framework, what's typically the biggest challenge for companies as they start thinking about this journey?
I'd say, based on experience, the setting roadmaps and targets can be quite challenging because, you know, in step one, if you're starting the journey from start to finish, fine, okay, we're assessing risks, we're measuring your footprint, it's more metric based, you know, you emit X ton of carbon per year. There are these, you know, clear sort of risk assessment frameworks we can use and studies we can do. But then the tough work really begins, right? Okay, we have this huge carbon footprint. We have this massive risk in our supply chain. Now we have to sit down and really have the tough conversations about what we can realistically, yet meaningfully in a science-backed way do. And, you know, that's never an easy process because there's invariably multiple parts of a business that may have, you know, challenging different interests, may have different points of view. Taking an action in the supply chain may impact another part of the business elsewhere, you know, and again, going back to one of our original points, for a sustainability strategy to really be successful, you need to have buy-in. You need to have buy-in from the top, and you need to have buy-in across the organization. So the roadmap and target phase, in my experience, is really, really critical and often the hardest part because that's kind of the make or break opportunity to get everyone to the table and align on, here's what we're going to do. And, you know, I'm a big proponent of the test and pivot approach to business. So, you know, you don't always have from day one the perfect strategy and the perfect approach, but you need to have the alignment and say, okay, we're going to set this target. We are going to go net zero by 2030. Here's the framework of how we're going to go about doing that over the next 5 years. So as anyone who's worked in a corporate setting probably knows, you know, achieving those levels of alignment and buy-in can definitely be a challenge. So voila. And then I think as well at the end of the journey, right? So when a company gets to the point where they've done all these things and then maybe they want to start talking about it more publicly, or they want to leverage and capitalize on their success, it's very often the most joyous part, right? And it can be the most exciting part, but it also can be rife with its own challenges in that anytime you start talking externally or taking a point of view or, you know, trying to take a leadership position, there are always voices in the market who are waiting to strike you down or might disagree or might construe things. And a lot of the things that a company might engage in, for example, if they are investing in emissions reductions projects, certain people might have points of view and say, oh, well, that isn't a worthwhile investment, you know. So I think that part of the journey can also be challenging at times as well.
I'd love to hear actually just a tiny bit more about that, this buy-in issue. You know, you can find folks at any company in all kinds of different roles who understand this, who get it, understand the imperative. You know, it's not just an ethical thing. I mean, this is strategic. This has very specific benefits to one's company. Where have you found that buy-in really needs to happen? Is this a C-level issue? Is this, you know, departmental? You know, and if you've been able to identify it, what are the tools internally that folks can use to you know, get that buy-in that they need?
I'll chime in again here. Go ahead, Charlie.
Okay. Well, I was just going to mention that a couple of the clients we're working with currently, they very much see that getting this kind of buy-in across the different departments is really critical. So they've assembled teams that sit across all sorts of functions that you know that wouldn't historically have sat in the room together: facilities, supply chains, procurement, risk, C-suite. And, you know, climate change, sustainability, they're such cross-cutting issues. And if you really play it forward and you think about the implications to any business model, you need the whole business represented at some level. And so increasingly, we are seeing these cross group of sort of function collaborations, and they're all seeing these risk assessments we do, and you know, the maps of, you know, with the dots and these sort of expanding red areas where potentially there are risks that are going to, you know, they're going to see in their supply chains, for example, and they're all realizing that there are, in some way, it impacts on their job and their role. So I think getting that recognition in the first place and getting the business to understand that all of these parties need to be in the room and represented on this agenda, that's one of the first critical steps.
Yeah. And even that can be a challenge, right? I mean, getting all of these very important people in a business in the room at the same time paying attention and then buying into what you're saying, you know, but that's a lot of the work we do. We kick off projects with these workshops, we create these sort of task forces within companies, we educate. And I use this, like the concept of a spinning top, to explain it sometimes, because it's great to set up these groups, but you have to have the right balance of buy-in and approval from the top. And so, you know, top-down ownership, but also the people maybe more in the middle of the company who can really make things happen day to day and be the culture disseminators as well. And if you get too much, you know, there's some companies where you'll see all the sustainability managers and mid-level management are super on board, but the CEO isn't convinced. You have to tackle that. And vice versa. You know, some people think if the C-suite is bought in, the rest will fall into place. But in my experience, that isn't the case. You need everyone bought in down at the operational levels too. So, you know, it's, if the top is spinning, it's that balance between both sides and making sure that these task forces and these cross-functional groups really have all of the right levels of people to make that happen. So key.
We've got a little bit of time left. I'll ask one more question, unless somebody raises their hand. Are you optimistic about corporate action on climate change? And if so, tell us why.
Yeah,
I am
the
super optimistic.
Muireann, I cut in there. You go first.
We're both so optimistic and excited that we start talking at the same time. This happens frequently. No, I think it's, you know, I've been in this space for close to a decade now, and just the change that we've seen and the progress and sort of the different types of conversations that are happening, I'm really optimistic. You know, I think corporate sustainability is having its moment. It's come into its own sort of ever since the Paris Agreement, and when businesses mobilized to make that happen, you know, that was a pivotal turning point. The sort of movement in financial markets, things like TCFD, you know, investors recognizing the value of environmental as well as other types of risk, you know, and action. I think all of this is putting us in the right direction. And perhaps somewhat ironically, the awful events of 2020, if anything, I think as we come out of this, and I'm optimistic we will, are going to continue to push us in the right direction. Because as you said earlier, Charlie, the last thing any business wants now is to be blindsided by another risk. And, you know, I think if we've learned anything, the world can change really, really quickly. And this is another, you can't call it a black swan, right? Because we've seen it coming. And I think the time is now here to really capitalize on this momentum, on this recognition of how fragile things might be, and, you know, continue the work.
Yeah, I agree. I've heard it called a Green Swan, actually, a Green Swan event by John Elkington. It's all these sort of this perfect storm of action. We've got policy drivers, we've got the investor community, we've got consumers, we've got the Greta effect, and it almost feels like they're combining into this kind of this moment in history where we all know it's got to happen, but, you know, I think the penny is dropping, and, you know, who would have foreseen where we are now? I mean, I've been in sustainability for 23 years, can you believe it? And, you know, this is the moment where I felt most excited about the agenda, and things are accelerating fast. And, you know, who knows where we're going to be in a couple of years' time. So I feel very optimistic and positive.
We got one more question. I promised everybody we'd wrap this up in less than an hour, so don't worry, we will. A question from Anne. I like this question because it's simultaneously very basic, but ends up being in some ways sort of summarizes everything that we've been talking about here. She's asking about different approaches to sustainability, and mentioning that a lot of times there's cost savings, you know, traditional financial bottom line to be had, in addition to a positive impact on perhaps other things. Energy is probably the most obvious cost saving, low hanging fruit there. And I think the question is really where is the balance, and what's really driving it here? You know, to what extent are companies really thinking, look, at the end of the day, this is all nice, but I got to have a financial payoff here? And to what extent are companies thinking about this thing in more abstract terms, you know, in broader sustainability terms, and to what extent is it a combination of all of the above? Hopefully I'm paraphrasing you correctly, Anne. If not, feel free to raise your hand and jump in.
Sure, I can take that. I think it's a combination. I think proving the business case through cost savings has got to be the first step. But I think increasingly, CFOs are recognizing the long-term share value, and certainly when the price of money is cheaper, if you get good ESG ratings, then that is going to send you a very strong signal as a CFO. And if your share value is hit like overnight because of a misstep on environmental sustainability, then that's going to wake you up. So I think it works on a number of levels, but when businesses who we're working with, when they really sit down and they look at all of the components together, they recognize that there is just a cast sort of iron case for sustainability, and there is no escaping it. To be a fully resilient business into the future, you have to have a very strong sustainability position.
Terrific. Without further ado, I think it's about time to wrap us up. Ramon, if you'd be so kind as to show us the slide with the upcoming schedule. We're going to be doing some more of these over the indefinite future. At some point, we hope to see you in person at conferences and other events. But for now, we have a terrific schedule of upcoming climate chatters. You can go to southpole.com/climate chatter. There's a hyphen in there. Next week, we're going to have a conversation with the global sustainability head of UPS, which should be really interesting. We'll have some direct interaction with a major company who's been taking some pretty cool action. We have a whole discussion on resilient supply chains on the 18th. On the 30th, we're going to do one with our friends at Sustainable Brands, talking about how climate action can strengthen your brand. And there's 4 or 5 more further out in June and July that you'll find on the schedule there as well. Thank you all for joining us. I really appreciate it. We'd love to hear from you. Any and all feedback is more than welcome. And a special thanks to Muireann and Charlie for taking the time today to talk to us.
Pleasure. Thank you very much for attending, everyone.
Thanks everyone.
Off we go.